Okay, hello. So now we're going to talk. I'm Pablo Sanchez. I'm going to be moderating this panel or the discussion. So we're going to talk about live, Ableton Live, and we have here TorstenSlama that was in charge of the first design for the live UI, so Live 1 in 2001. And then we had Ed Macovaz, that is head of design for Ableton. So the dynamics of the talk would be basically I will be handing some visual support, and we will have some conversation around the images. So let's start. My first question is for you, Ed. What is live exactly?
What is live? So live is software for making music. It's, I guess, whenever other people that are better at doing it than me talk about it, they talk about the main difference between it and software that came before it was that it has a concept of putting music together in a non-linear way. Like most software up until that was like a computer pretending to be a tape machine that had a timeline, and I think although it was probably around in other software, Live made this idea of composing in a non-linear way with what we call clips to be a thing. Yes, that's my rough description of it.
Cool.
But it's many things to many people.
So now if we think of the first live UI that you designed, Torsten, and with this kind of definition that we heard from it, do you think that do you recognize this life that Ed describes as the same one that you designed?
Well, I definitely see that it has developed more in the direction which Ed just described, and I think it had the weakness in the beginning that it was actually more linear than its potential in praxis and just developed, which then made it actually less linear. Also during the time when I developed the interface, but I think the structure was very clearly defined from the beginning, even when the visuals weren't very well defined. Oh yes. So the structure could also be described very, very simply as horizontal and vertical.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that made a big difference, and that got further kind of implemented, the virtue of this kind of different visual representation of music.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite important, I
so
guess.
In the moment that you designed it, can you tell us about like the process? In the process, I mean in terms of what was the team setup, what were the roles? I guess like in 2000, it was a really different team than the one that we have today with Ableton.
There was a team, and that consisted mostly of programmers, and there was
Mm-hmm.
another team, and that was the kind of core marketing team. And the team for the visual design wasn't really so much of a team, because it was basically me interacting very, very much with the founder, Gerhard Bieles,
Mm-hmm.
who was very much kind of, who had a very clear structural representation of
Mm-hmm.
what he wanted, and was thankfully very open when it came to the visual representation, to the actually the design of elements, the kind of what a button or a knob or things like that would look like. He was not really, he didn't really have a fixed idea at all in the beginning, and was very kind of willing to accept anything which looked reasonable to him. And then you asked me before that, because it seems to be common knowledge now. He was very kind of, one day he came to me and said he saw something in a documentation about cockpits for
Mm-hmm.
planes, and he really liked the idea that the pilot, the responsible person, needs to get information really fast. So it was very much about information design, and I think that actually played a significant role for what I was doing then, because then I really concentrated on the idea that any value must be somehow clearly represented. And of course it's a challenge when there are very many parameters which have to be shown and present on the screen.
So in a way, like I guess it was like more like a dialogue between you and Gerhard.
Yes, that's actually what I was meaning to say.
Okay, and then you have like this airplane cockpit, like the visual.
No, actually, it was just I never really looked at airplane, or not, maybe once or something.
Okay.
It was more the idea. It was he kind of illustrated what he thought was really, really important, and I agreed. So then I followed that advice.
Mhm.
And well, maybe I must say, if I remember it correctly, then Robert Henke was also involved,
Mhm.
and of course the CTO, what's TEO, Bernd Roggendorf. So, but it was mainly Gerhard.
Mhm. So I guess this is a totally different setup that we can think of in current Ableton. I think if we think of Ableton as a company, but if we focus on live, can you explain us a bit about what is the team setup for this software nowadays?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's I don't think it's changed so much, in that a lot of what we do is still a dialogue between someone who sees themselves in some sort of design role and someone who sees themselves in a role as having a vision of a product, and there's some engineers along for the ride who also make contributions. I guess the biggest change is that it's gotten bigger and it's no longer just one group of people. So the complexity comes from live is now, I think, 4 or 5 teams of people, each trying to work independently on different parts of the software.
Mhm.
And then there's a group of people focused on the product vision. There's multiple people in these design roles, and there are many more engineers. And so this first part of the setup that I describe I don't think has changed too much from what Torsten described, but now there's a whole bunch of other relationships. So you're not the only designer working on it. You need to talk to the other
Mhm.
designers that are working on other different parts and come up with a strategy for how your independent work makes sense. The
Mhm.
engineers need to do the same thing. The people thinking about the product vision need to do the same thing. And then, even though we're just talking about live, the people in live are no longer able to just think about live because we have other products as well. So things we change in live affect push, for
Mhm.
example.
So in this, in this immediacy that Torsten was talking about, just like talking with somebody else versus this kind of now new relation that you would in Ableton, what do you think that are like the benefits or the constraints that you work out with? In the sense, is there something that you can take of it that you didn't have before, or that you don't have, or do you lose some immediacy but you win in some other places?
I don't think the difference between the two situations arose out of a conscious choice to change how we work. It more comes from dealing with the realities of growth.
Okay.
Basically, after 15 years of building something, it is more complex than it was at the beginning. So the amount of people required to make a change is larger than
Mhm.
it was at the beginning. And so there's a bunch of things that you need to do when you have a larger group of people that you didn't need to do when you had a smaller group of people. I think
Mhm.
what Torsten describes is, I think, what everyone would like to still be doing, but we just can't. It's if we did that now, then I think it would get messy. Or it would really depend very, very much on whatever sort of ideas people happen to have. You might get lucky and it would all end up in a good place, or you might get very unlucky and it ends up in a very bad place.
Mhm.
I think it comes naturally from the complexity that comes from scale.
Mhm. Cool. So now if we look a bit more on the UI and we think about like the visual design or the design choices that we made, Torsten, we're looking now at one that is a refined version, so it's Live 10. But if we think of the moment that you started design, we talked about airplane cockpit as a concept. That was the only philosophy that was behind, or what other kind of philosophy drove it?
I wouldn't even say that it was a philosophy. It was an illustration of a philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
It was a kind of idea which helped concentrate on what was the main problem to be solved, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could say, I think what's kind of clever and interesting about the whole design, it's like maybe the first version of Windows, because it doesn't have overlapping windows,
Mm-hmm.
but that creates also a problem, of course, because you have to show each and every parameter every time, all the time on the screen. Well, not really, but it's definitely easier to just kind of open a window and then make it vanish again, or it seems easier, but it also grows confusing. And here you have a kind of gestalt,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's very important. That is maybe much more part of the philosophy than a word like cockpit. Because
Mhm.
cockpit, of course, would be misleading. A cockpit, because you have controls, and the cockpit mainly shows, what it shows something. It is kind of one directional, and the ultimate aim of your interaction with the computer is, of course, something, and that is really a difference. What I said, when you have this kind of dial which shows its own value, it's a hybrid between something which you supposedly, not really, but turn
Mm-hmm.
and handle, and so it actually serves both sides, input and output.
Mm-hmm.
Additionally, that was very often, is still because you have a keyboard.
I guess you mentioned like this idea of the pop-ups or the windows, the pop-up windows, that it's something that Ableton Live tries to avoid.
Yes.
So I guess like this was one choice, and the other one that I feel that still remains like pretty untouched is this idea of flat design, like a couple of choices that were made that still remain in this sense. How is that you end up like doing this kind of flat design? Was a choice that you made because...
And I think that has something to do with that I had a very short stint before for the for the competition, Native Instruments,
Mm-hmm.
and they had a product which was mainly just kind of done by the programmer.
Mhm.
And I got the job of making it look more, and he actually said something, I found that really kind of repulsive. He said, now we're going to have a more sexy interface.
Mm-hmm.
So they wanted it to look more appealing. Basically, I would suppose, I would think to men. That's why this came from, I guess. So what I ended up with was really quite horrible, because I just kind of took the whole interface, which was already there, programmed, and added three-dimensional looking
Mm-hmm.
controllers. They looked like putty or something, or like some kind of plastics material lying on top of a flat surface. Really stupid and quite bad. But I talked with Bernd, who was also working. He was later very involved in Ableton, and he said something like, which sounded really good. He said something like, "Torsten, you must think what you're doing now is totally free of the constraints of physical reality. So you can make something which does really crazy things, and there's no gravity and things like that, and blobs and shapes and things like that." But that was kind of, it didn't lead anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So I was kind of predisposed when I got a second chance to go more in that direction, and it was perfectly fine with it. Though that wasn't really what he didn't say, set off saying something like, "We need a flat design." I just kind of felt an inclination to go there. And once I started, everything became quite easy because it's very kind of limited, the choices you have, because actually to make something look three-dimensional helps very often. You know? It creates contrast and depth or perceived depth, adds a lot of information. So you had to kind of, it's actually what you mentioned, when you have limitations, it helps.
Yep.
It's like taking the color yellow out, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, it looks like, I mean, now we talk about flat design, it seems like a pretty obvious choice because everybody, it's a big trend. But back in the days, I guess it was a really thought choice that didn't have to do with all the other companies that were building softwares with this kind of skeuomorphic design. I guess like nowadays at Ableton, what is like, is there like a design philosophy behind the refinements that you work with Ableton Live among the design team?
Yeah, I mean, when I started working on Live, that wasn't so long ago. That was only, I think, 4 years ago. One of the first things I did with some of the other people was to try and work out what it is that makes Live live, because I guess the goal of our change was not to make it into a different thing, but make it into a better version of itself. And we needed to work out what it was that made it itself. And by that point, the aesthetic that Live had was very much established, and you could often these sort of this very minimalist aesthetic versus something that's much more maximalist or references reality a bit more. One's seen as like being very functional and rational, and the other one is like trying to appeal to people's emotions. But by this point, this aesthetic was something that people very much had an emotional connection to in Live, to the point where they rationalized that it has functional consequences. Like people will say things like, I like Live because it has this minimal UI, which means it's not using very much processing power, which leaves more for my music, which is completely untrue. It has no basis in fact. But once people develop an understanding of these things, I learned the hard way that you can try and convince them of the truth, which can be very painful, or you can just try and roll with it. And so I guess we realized that this minimalism, this visual reduction was something of Live, and that there are a few other things as well. Like I guess there's very much an idea of it being systematic and it being uniform, I guess. I don't like to reference native always, but propeller heads are another good example. They make a piece of software, but there are components in it that are devised as having their own world visually. Each one of them could be its own separate product. It's like they started from scratch and they all sit within the container of reason, whilst Live very much goes in the other direction. It says, no, we have a box of Lego blocks, and each time you make a thing, you can choose the Lego blocks you use and how you arrange them, but it's all composed of the same substance. And so there's a few things like this that we came up with, and it also comes up with when we sat down to work on Push, we had to work out what things about Push would be different to Live and what things would be similar. And some of it was just, what things would we do if we didn't have the same rules that we've had for 12 years with Live?
Yeah, I guess you talked about this emotional attachment that some users have with the current Live. So how do you deal with, how do you change things when they seem to work? Or how do you decide what to change when it seems to work?
How do you do it carefully? Like I said, you get excited by change as a designer. You get this idea that you can make things better, and then you have to make things worse many, many times before you realize that new things are quite easy because there wasn't a previous version that it would be worse than. So I've learnt with something with Live, and it feels like a burden as a designer, but it's without getting too wanky about it, like it's a really great thing that there are so many people that have spent so much time learning this thing that you actually have a lot to disrupt. If no one cared, that would be worse. Like if you changed it completely and people were like, yeah, okay, whatever, then you'd feel like no one cared about what you were doing. So I think when we change these things, we have to be careful, and we haven't come up with a good system, because it seems to be some part relying a lot on different people's intuition that know a lot about the software and use the software a lot, but also then just putting it in front of people and seeing whether it works or doesn't, and then doing it again, and then putting it in front of more people and seeing who screams the loudest, and then working out whether the people screaming represent a large group of people or a small group of people. And okay, if we're showing it to 1,000 people and there's this many people screaming, if we give it to 100,000 people, how many people will be screaming then? And it's just managing the scream, I guess.
So now you're talking about hundreds of people looking at your features. How do you deal with this feedback with users? What channels do you use, or how do you talk with users?
We have some software tools that are kind of like, I guess, a forum where people can go, and we'll give them an early version of the software, and they will talk about what makes them happy or what makes them sad, or what makes them think we should be fired, or what makes them really angry. It happens. You do this, you have to develop like a way of rationalizing that they don't know who I am and they're not really thinking about what they're saying. We've just made them a bit angry because we've changed something that they like. They don't actually want me to be fired, because they do say that sometimes. But there aren't really good tools for this, because it has the same problems that social media and forums have on the internet, that there's a couple of occasions where me or designers have actually forced ourselves to sit down and count the different comments and put them in a spreadsheet to work out, because it's really easy to have a long thread and it sounds like a huge amount of people have a single opinion, and you realize it's just 2 or 3 people talking to each other back and forth and basically exaggerating on top of each other. And then every now and then someone says, if they really like it, that can be happening, and then someone will be like, no, I don't really like it, and they're like, no, it's really good because, and you can, so it's, the tools aren't very good. The internet and the web in general make it easier to get feedback from a much larger group of people, which is useful, but compared to sitting in a room with a person or people, it's much easier to misjudge what the group is actually saying. And also there's a problem that you have, I think, that's not specific to music software, but any product that people use, you get it with internet reviews of restaurants and hotels as well. Someone has a shitty experience and they need to go and make someone hear about their shitty experience. Someone has a good experience, they enjoy themselves, they get on with their lives, and they don't say anything. So you sit there, you gave it to 100 people, 5 people said it was crap, 2 people said thank you. What do the other 93 people think? Like, are they not talking to me because they don't care? Are they not talking because they're happy and they've got better things to do and they're just using it to make music?
Yeah.
This is really hard. We've found no good way around this.
I guess for you, Torsten, was a totally different thing. I don't know if you talked at all with users, or you had like some kind of, how did you deal with this kind of feedback?
No, I didn't really engage in this kind of work. But it was being done already. I mean, it started quite early that there was a focus on creating a community and having people giving their input and become engaged and empowered users. And I think they even did things like inviting top users to have a look at the office or something. So that also already happened around my time, but I had this kind of, actually it was very nice for me, because for some reason nobody kind of demanded of me to take part in these things. So I guess something which you didn't address is that my background was a little bit different, and one could say not really that professional. But I was allowed to work maybe more like an artist works, very kind of self-referential and not really kind of concerned with the outside world to such a degree.
Yep.
That was the job others did.
Yeah, I was gonna come just to this that you're talking about now, because I guess like you're a fine artist, so I'm fascinated about what do you think about, or what do you think that are like the common grounds between painting and UI design, for example? This is, we just put like, I think this is one of your paintings, right? Do you see any link between the two disciplines, or how do you think that they communicate?
There's one very kind of, if you look at the shape, some people actually didn't like it because this painting, because it looks a bit like a widescreen display. And some people prefer, I'm among them, the old-fashioned, narrower 4:3 displays. So it is actually a screen, and it's two-dimensional. And if you work especially as a painter, or if you do drawings, you're working two-dimensionally. And I think that plays a big role, and that is a very kind of important connection between the two. My inclination was actually to think two-dimensionally, not really in depth. And but the other thing is, I think if you go through the history of software and hardware development, I was at the time very much into the origins, the early uses of computers in education, for example, or in music, and the origins of man-machine interaction, and there were many kind of very interesting characters involved. And I think very important for me was somebody who was called Alan Kay, who is credited with inventing or kind of first visualizing the laptop or the kind of window. And he was doing this programming language Smalltalk and having this machine at Xerox, and that was very influential for Apple later on, or for the Lisa, which was then turned into the Macintosh, maybe one could say, or maybe not. Anyway, so he was very important. He's still very kind of important in the way that he's still invited to talk about software design very often, and hardware design, and interface design. And he would say, for example, that he always thought it's totally very, very important to have in a development team a fine artist involved. So he had this kind of clear idea. There are people who are called artists, and they work differently. And nowadays you don't have these clear differences anymore, I think. You know? Because artists don't really necessarily work like artists, or kind of look like artists. And things like that. But I think the idea is that you have somebody who is allowed to kind of have a different pursuit, actually, and have a different ambition than you would have. You described yourself as somebody who has to deal with administrative decisions very often. And you are totally limited very often in your freedom and your imagination. And I was, for a short phase, allowed to not being limited by that. And that was, of course, for me, and I think for the product, very fruitful.
That's really interesting. So I guess, like, I don't know, now we talk about this kind of, I don't know if the word is outsider, but people that are not really designers. I heard, like, for example, Nintendo used to try to hire designers that are not really game designers, but are designers. I don't know what is there is a philosophy, like something like this in Ableton? Like, if people need to know a lot about music, or?
This is a topic that's been, I wouldn't say like a big tension, but it's a tension that has existed pretty much since I've been at Ableton. Like how much we benefit from people being very much in the topic and how much we benefit from people having distance from the domain. And the only conclusion I can be at this point is that both are of benefit, and it's about establishing the right balance, and it's kind of, it almost comes down to like the right combination of people. Like you can sort of see that two people will work very well together because one of them just intuitively sees these things and another one fills in the gaps that they missed because they're focused on something. But I guess I tend to, because I've made music, I still make music, but it's not at the same level as a lot of other people at Ableton. I'm more on the side of distance. I guess when it comes down to it, you're two groups of people that each feel their perspective is valuable, and so don't want a description of the world that says they're not a valuable one. So if you say like, no, it's really important that people are all about music making, then the people that aren't all about music making are like.
You still have.
We still have Robert Henke involved, yes.
And he represents the music side, doesn't he?
Not alone, but he brings, I guess, very clear ideas of what things could be and how they should work that are informed by his ongoing practice as an artist, as a musician. So he I guess comes at it very much from that side, but having had so much experience with making software, he also has a clear understanding of the kind of things that are possible and can phrase it in our language. We then have people that sort of sit at different points in that spectrum. What we don't have is people that have zero interest in music. We've never managed to find someone that was so good at being a designer or an engineer that like they weren't excited about music. We have people that maybe don't make music so much. We have people that maybe make music but not with something like live, people that play the clarinet, which is also cool. But the thing that comes to it is if you're honest, making the kind of products we make at times is a complete pain in the ass. Like you need something to motivate you to do all of the annoying things that actually will make it hopefully good at the end. Like if making good products was easy, there'd be a lot more good products out there. Life would be less interesting, but in the end, it's a lot of work and it can sometimes be really annoying. So you have to have something behind it that you like. So we end up with all these. You need someone that probably has some motivations beyond just the job.
Yep.
But then that's sort of motivation is one thing, but then levels of domain knowledge. I think there's benefits in all of it. Like maybe just one last example. One of the more recent designers we hired, Julka, doesn't make music. But one thing she does do is she does live visuals, and she does this with analog video synthesizers. So she has something that looks like a modular audio synthesizer, but instead it produces video. So she'll do visuals for DJs or artists performing with a bunch of boxes with cables and encoders, no computers anywhere. And I think her perspective on stuff is really interesting because she is familiar with the kind of complexity that is a similar level to ours, and there are a lot of concepts that are very similar to ours, but it's not the same as ours. So she has, I think there's cases where she can look at things and see them differently to everyone else, which is important.
Yep. Cool. I think we're running out of time, so I would like to ask you a couple of questions, just like to end. Torsten, I don't know, I know that you designed this 2001 Live UI. I don't know if you had the chance during these years to work again with music.
The chance? No. But an inclination and interest, yes.
Yep.
I'm totally into music.
Yep.
But I'm really kind of limited because I'm like the average music lover. I think, you know, like I really love music, and I think it's so much. Really, it's like this joke. I could hear every word, but I didn't know what it meant, which in German actually is quite funny because it's not funny in English.
I disagree.
So, you know, I think that music is fascinating, and it requires a lot of intelligence, and I seem to not really have that intelligence. I just have I seem to have the intelligence of a listener, you know, like the intelligence of a consumer. You know, people who use, for example, the software and kind of form opinions, but somebody who kind of programs it knows that they are really having no clue. So, yeah, I never played, for example, when I was very young, I played in a band, for example. I would love to now, but
Yeah.
I don't actually find other band members.
Okay, so, and for you, Ed, can you talk us about future of life?
How much trouble do I want to get in? Probably not a lot. So, I mean, live's in an interesting point where it's become, I don't want to say ubiquitous, but it's very, very widely spread in a certain kind of music. And it's a kind of music that at the moment has become very popular in some places. And so it has a huge legacy. It has a lot of, it's quite widespread at the moment. So I think the future of live is somehow about, that's a challenge. Like people reach a certain tipping point and maybe they lose their way. So I think for us, it's really, it's walking this line between new people that come to live and people that have been there the whole time or have been there a long time, and working out how to find the right balance of moving forward. So it will need to change and develop, but if it becomes something completely different, that probably doesn't make sense either. But I guess live has it has a lot in common with software like what Adobe makes.
Mm-hmm.
And see them dealing with the challenge there, where they stuff like Photoshop and Illustrator ended up being used for things that they never meant for it to be used for, and it took Adobe a very long time to make something that was actually intended for that. And in the meantime, other people came out with things like Sketch or Figma or whatever, and I guess we have competitors and there's changes in technology, so it's a real, I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I have a feeling it's navigating these tensions. Like, because if we try to make everything new, we'll burn things down with people inside it, and that will not work.
Sounds reasonable.
Yeah, that's. But if we don't change, then there'll be other more interesting places to go.
Cool.
That's a tough one.
Yep. Cool. I don't know if we have time for questions now, or we need a break. So maybe we can. Couple of questions. Somebody wants to ask something? Yep. Here, if you don't mind.
You were talking about horizontal and vertical representation of music. Is that the logo, and did you make the logo?
The logo? What was the question about the logo?
You were talking about horizontal and vertical representation of music. Is that the logo, and did you make the logo? I think that's a no.
Oh, that actually.
Yeah, wait a minute.
I don't remember. No, actually, I do remember. I think they kind of, before me, they hired some designer. And he kind of did that. And Ableton, in a very round type.
Yep.
Is it hands?
So
is it
yeah,
four?
I found that actually.
Well, that's the newer one. I had, when we were doing the rebrand, I had some conversations with the founders, and you're never sure whether these things are actually the way people describe them, because it was 10 years ago, and sometimes I even noticed stuff 4 years ago. I was like, this is how it happened. That's not how it happened. But what I was told was that it was supposed to be a representation of notes on musical notation. So the horizontal part is the staff, and then kind of a simplified idea of music, but was supposed to also convey the idea of people dancing and movement. But people looked at it and they're like, it's like the software. And so it's weird that by the time we got round to designing the newer version and simplifying it, the agency thought that we were working with already had it in their head that it represented the software and the dualities in the software, and a couple of times people were like, that's not actually what it is. And then we were like, what's the point? Does that really matter? It's like, it's 8 rectangles.
I thought that one was what it was.
Yeah, I think this is one of those things, it's a Rorschach. Like, people look at it and they see stuff, and if it makes them feel good, then I guess that's good. Yeah, I can't get a straight answer on what it actually is supposed to be, which maybe is also a good thing. Yeah.
You said about the horizontal and vertical thing, the plugins, it's all there, doesn't need a pop-up, but a question, you said like before it's like a I open a external plugin, like with a window and that kind of thing, it's there like of the future to put something different. Better to use like a external plugin.
It is something that we think about. It is like a contradiction that sits there in the software, that there's two different ways of what a device should look like. Like we have our way, and then there's these compromises that you have to we wanted to support a third-party technology that thinks of things differently to how we think of it, and our way is a compromise, their way is a different compromise. Having both of them is another compromise. I think we would like it to work better. I'm not sure if that would mean us making things more like the way third parties do it. There's maybe other ways, but it is, I guess, all I could say is that we see there's room for improvement there as well, even though we're fairly convinced of the merits of kind of the fundamentals of our approach. This, what Torsten was talking about, of having everything available on screen. When you're trying to move quickly, you want to minimize the amount of choices people make, and choosing exactly where something goes is a choice that generally you can avoid making.
Can I add something?
Yeah, certainly.
Because I've been thinking about that beforehand actually. I would like to do something like in a Buñuel film. I would like to talk about a dream I had, which was, I was dreaming I was working for Ableton again, and I was talking to somebody, maybe you, but I didn't know you then, and I was talking about my ideas I had and something, and this other person was really strict and said something that was a really loud kind of sentence which stayed with me when I woke up. He said, you know, in the future, our software will render itself.
That might not have been me. I can imagine a few people who that might have been, but that wasn't me. Interesting.
Cool. Any other questions? So we should do a short break, I think.
Let him ask us a question.
Yep. Okay.
You talked about the importance of persons out of the topic working in this area. But then you said that anyone that actually are not interested into music. So can you make the difference between being interested having knowledge about the topic. Because I might like listen to music, but actually be or have knowledge about the topic.
So the question is it enough to know about something even if you're not interested in it, or
It's actually
the other way around?
yeah.
I guess it depends on the role, but generally in our experience, knowledge tends to follow interest. So,
But I might be able. I might like to listen to music, but
yeah, that I'd say that's probably not enough. There's a certain threshold that you need to reach where you need to bring some sort of knowledge to things. Like, I mean, we and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we have a lot of people that would like to work on our products because they're very interested in what we do, but they don't have a background or a set of skills that would bring a lot to a team. But like I said, normally knowledge follows interest, so if people are interested in something for long enough, they will find ways to learn more about it, or they'll lose interest.
Oh, I think we have to stop it here. Thanks a lot, Torsten, and thanks, Ed,
Thank you,
for
Pablo.
being here.